Sophie Hardy and the Changeling Hybrid by M.R. Dale. Narrated by Leona Hall. Chapter 29. Not My Son. Some children shot for the window to get a better look. Some sat in silence and disbelief, and others screamed at the top of their lungs. Sophie, Yasmin and Clara looked at each other in an attempt to have one of their silent conversations about what best to do. Mrs. Tabard ran out of the room, probably to warn the class next door. The children at the window could make out some giant figure moving on the field, but the fence was a bit too thick for them to see through it properly. However, the banging sound that Sophie had heard made sense. Now at the front of the room, conveniently the place furthest away from the back door that led onto the field, Mrs. Phoenix tried her best to calm everyone. "I'm sure it's someone playing a joke on us. There'll be no need to worry." Being older than 10, Mrs. Phoenix could remember a time when dragons roamed free, and she knew that you didn't want to get on the wrong side of one. So she was doing her best to try and keep herself calm, as well as a class of 10-year-olds. As it happened, it was something she wasn't very good at. Just then, a huge roar reverberated into the classroom from outside. Everyone now turned to look at the window. Even those who were sat agog couldn't ignore it. The tops of the trees that lined the edge of the field were now in flames, and the stomping noise that Sophie had assumed was in her head was now deafeningly thumping around the room. "I think it might be true, miss," Sophie said calmly. "Be quiet," Mrs. Phoenix snapped back as she quite aggressively twisted her shirt. Sophie could see that the supply teacher was in no state to be concentrating on a whole class of now screaming children, and so jumped over the table to sit nearer to Yasmin and Clara, who were also starting to look slightly worried. "What do we do?" Sophie asked. "We can't do anything while we're stuck in here," Yasmin replied. "Getting a message to Miss Sissons should be first, surely," Clara suggested. "Agreed," Sophie replied. "Send it, Yas." Yasmin zoned out at the table, but nobody had any interest in looking at her, and so she did it without any unwanted attention. "Done," she said about 10 seconds later. Sophie and Clara surveyed the room. "There has to be some way we can zone out and get onto the field," Sophie said determinedly. "You aren't serious?" Yasmin replied. "It's our job," Sophie snapped back. "This is what we signed up for. We've trained against dragons loads of times in the playground. Now we can do it for real." Yasmin looked at Clara for some reassurance that it wasn't just her that was thinking that going out there as a 10-year-old schoolchild to face a huge fire-breathing creature of certain death was, to put it mildly, a bad idea. As a result, no such response came, and Clara just shrugged at Yasmin. Sophie scanned the room again. The only other child who wasn't now at the window was Kingsley. He was sat with his head in his hands, much as he had been throughout the maths lesson. Sophie didn't have time to worry about him, although she did notice that the blue under his skin had now gone. Looking towards the main classroom door, Sophie noticed that Mrs. Phoenix was reaching for the handle. "Stay here!" she shouted. "You aren't leaving us!" Sophie shouted back in disbelief. "I'll be back! Stay here!" The rest of the class didn't notice her leave, but the 3 girls most certainly did. As the door slammed shut, another tremendous roar came from the field, and the trees that were on fire collapsed. The fence separating the children from the dragon also started to wobble, and the children who had charged for a closer look near the window took a step back for the first time. "Got it," Clara sounded relieved. "That fence is going to buckle, and then the dragon can get through. If we can get everyone onto the playground at the front of the school, then we can zone out into the field and distract it." "Distract a dragon?" Yasmin asked, querying Clara's choice of words. "Have you got a better idea?" Clara barked back. Yasmin could see no real alternative. "How do we get everyone onto the playground, though?" she asked. "Leave that to me," Sophie said, having a sudden bolt of an idea. She stood up, walked over to the wall and, without hesitation, smashed the fire alarm. Having done many fire drills in her time at school, Sophie knew that the place the children always gathered in such an event was the playground, as far away from the field as you could get without leaving the school grounds, as it was on the other side of the building. As nobody saw her do it, the children in the room assumed that someone else in another class had set it off, and they all made their way as calmly as they could away from the window and went out the main door, which in this scenario doubled as the fire exit. The only person that didn't move was Kingsley. "What about him?" Yasmin asked. Can't do anything. We only have a few minutes before they do the register and realise that we aren't there, Clara said. We have to zone out. Onto the field. Now. Sophie and Yasmin agreed, so they got comfy in their chairs, laid their heads on their desk and zoned out. Their avatars appeared on the field immediately, and there stood the magnificent beast, true and proud. Behind it, 3 women in green cloaks and hoods. Sophie looked hard, but couldn't make out their faces as they were bowed and not looking up. As soon as the dragon caught sight of the girls, it settled down. It was almost as if the whole purpose had been to get their attention. Continuing to patrol behind the 3 women, walking back and forth, the dragon snorted, and one of the women raised a hand to indicate that it should stop. The dragon did indeed stop and stood to face the girls head-on, like the world's largest guard dog. Unfazed by the whole event, like it was all just a game, Sophie walked forwards and got within an earshot of the women. Clara and Yasmin followed, a little more apprehensively. We're here for the hybrid. It's time to leave, the woman in the centre said without raising her head. Pardon? Sophie replied. The hybrid. Give it to us, and no harm will come to anyone, said the woman on the right. We don't know of any hybrid, Clara said, channeling some of Sophie's confidence. This is a school, and it's protected. The hybrid wants us all to go home, said the final woman. We need it. We don't know what it is, Clara added. Tell us more. For years we have remained stuck in your world. We want to go home and take many with us. The hybrid allows us to do that, for the danger is coming, said the first woman, still without moving her head and with almost no emotion in her voice. The 3 girls all looked at each other and shrugged. Yasmin contacted Miss Sissons. Are you getting this? She asked. Yes, was the reply in the girl's ear. I think they're changelings. What are they talking about? Sophie asked Miss Sissons. What hybrid? I'm not sure. Give me a minute, Miss Sissons replied. Sophie studied more closely the women that stood in front of her. They were wearing the same colour that the woman who was staring at them across the road yesterday. Your time is running out, the second woman said. Hold on, we're working on it, Clara said, attempting to stall the unwelcome visitors. Whilst all the parties were stood round waiting, the gate to the field suddenly flew open. Everyone's eyes darted to the side to see who it was. There was a blue glow around the unexpected visitor. They were making their way across the field, and they were shouting something incomprehensible from the distance they were at. Sophie stared and listened harder. As the figure got closer, Sophie realised that it was Kingsley, and what he was shouting was, Get away from me! Can't you just leave us alone? The 3 women dropped their hoods and turned to face him. The dragon also rode up on its back legs and got into an attack position. Kingsley, wait! Sophie shouted. He ignored her, or couldn't hear her, and continued to stride towards the 3 women and the dragon, apparently completely fearless of the 30-foot monster that was roaming menacingly around the school field. Sophie's gaze drew back to the women and their now visible faces. Their noses were long and pointy, and their skin appeared to be almost hanging off. Their eyes were neon blue like Kingsley's, and the majority of their hair had fallen out. Slowly, they began pacing in different directions. One walked towards Kingsley, one headed towards the 3 girls, and the final one turned to face the dragon and calmed him as he was becoming agitated. Sophie, Clara and Yasmin drew back like they'd been trained to and looked to see what the woman would do. Before she got anywhere near them, though, Kingsley had fired a blue bolt out of his blue glowing hand and had made the woman that was heading for him completely disappear. Sophie furrowed her brow. Yasmin stepped forward from the group of 3 and started to walk towards the woman, who was still not walking too quickly. It was like a fight in slow motion. After Yasmin had taken about 5 steps, the woman raised her finger and a bolt of what could only be described as blue electricity shot out from it. Yasmin screamed slightly as the bolt travelled towards her. Fearing the worst, she bent down and tried to avoid it, although it was impossible because the lightning was travelling so incredibly quickly. Unbeknown to Yasmin, the bolt passed straight through her and hit the hedge at the back of the field. Sophie and Clara instantly understood that by them being in their avatars, they would be very difficult to harm, and Sophie's confidence in the whole thing feeling like a game became even more real. Clara stepped forward and ran at the woman. The changeling aimed her finger again, but the bolt went straight through Clara and into the hedge again. Clara didn't break stride and continued to run at her. Just as soon as she was in arm's reach, she stopped suddenly as the woman became entombed in a bright blue ball. She was lifted off the ground and Clara got a really close-up look at her wart-ridden, loose-skinned monstrosity of a face. She cackled and screamed from inside the sphere and was slowly lifted from the ground. Clara looked round to see that Kingsley was in full control of the sphere and was almost toying with the woman inside it. He was lifting her, dropping her and pulling her side to side. Looking more closely at his neon blue face, Clara could see a huge smile on it. This worried her almost more than the huge dragon that was being set up to do goodness knows what. As Kingsley continued to throw the woman about, he stopped for a split second while she was mere inches from Clara's face. The changeling leant forward, looked Clara dead in the eyes, and pointed at her. "You are not from this world," she said, and Clara's avatar's hair changed from black to blonde to red and back to black. As soon as she finished her sentence, she vanished from right in front of Clara. Slightly dazed, Clara turned to look at Sophie and Yasmin, but neither of them was looking at her. They were both staring at the final woman, who was standing under the dragon, holding a large sword above its foot. Knowing what the woman intended to do, Sophie went running towards her. Before she had taken a step, or even thought about zoning to her, the woman raised the sword into the air and shouted, "You were given a chance!" Immediately, the woman slammed the sword into the dragon's foot. Then the woman disappeared before the eyes of the 4 children on the field. The dragon screeched, and a few windows on the top floor of the school smashed. The agents of Scope looked at one another and tried to work out how to stop an actual dragon from harming every child in school. The Sophie Hardy saga was written and produced by Emma Dale and narrated and produced by Leona Hall. If you enjoyed it and would like to continue to follow the adventures of Sophie and her friends in coming episodes, then please subscribe through one of the many podcast providers out there. The links for each of these can be found on our website. If you require more information, visit our many social media channels, or if you would like to purchase a hard copy of the book, then be sure to check out www.sophiehardysaga.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy.